We came for salvation. We came for family. We came for all that's good. That's how we'll walk away.
Aloha, and welcome to the Layman's Lounge podcast, a ministry of the laymanslounge.com, where we exist to hit you with some everyday theology for everyday life. And on the other line is Matthew B. Redmond. Aloha, brother. What do you got? What were you listening to today?
Music wise?
Yeah.
What was I listening to?
Or what's been hot? What's been hot lately?
All right, the things I've been listening to the most, I've been listening to, do you know who Brian Fallon is?
No.
He was lead singer of the Gaslight Anthem.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's got some solo stuff, and I've been listening to his album that he put out basically about a year ago. Let's see. Our family likes Need to Breathe a lot, so we've listened to them a little bit. Some Billie Holiday.
Okay, yeah, a little old school. And
yeah.
you have a full size Bob Dylan tattoo on your back, right?
No. You know, it's so funny. I'm always listening to Dylan, and I don't ever answer the question with Dylan because it's just kind of always going on. But yeah, listen to some Dylan too.
We had Tish Warren on the show, and we saw on one of her books she quoted Fugazi, and that's cool that you just gave us a Gaslight Anthem reference. I'm trying to gather anyone who loves punk and make sure to have them on the show. So
that is hilarious. Listen, if our family has a band, and these are my 3 homeschool kids, okay? If our family has a band, it's the Gaslight Anthem. And I mean, we've been my kids, they were reared on that. I mean, when was that? Gosh, 13 years ago, 59 Sound came out and got all those accolades. And that's when I discovered at the end of 2008. And oh my gosh. And of course, I grew up listening to The Clash and, so Social Distortion, stuff like that. So
yeah, bro. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I fell in love with that band. Still a big fan.
Well, what's the hit? We'll post up your best hit, bro. What's your best Gaslight Anthem song?
Well, it's funny because the first volume of this book, the first publishing, I actually used a quote by them.
Oh.
It's not in the second one. I found one that I felt like was a little bit more appropriate. But I still love it, and I kind of wish I'd kept it. It's from the song May off of Handwritten, and it's the one where he says, "We work our fingers down to dust, and we wait for the kingdom to come with the radio on." And I love that. Did you know that Brian Fallon is a believer?
I think I deduced that.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy? Like, you can listen to some great interviews with him, and he just talks about it like the same way we would talk about anything else. It's fascinating.
I think the guy from the Smoking Popes is too, but I don't remember. There's some others out there, some holdouts.
I want to say somebody told me that. I don't know their music, but it seems like there was some other band, and I can't remember. It was one I didn't know, and they were like, "Well, that guy is too." Wow.
But if you're a listener and you know some proper punk or indie rock or Americana who walks with Jesus, send it in. Let's bump that. We'll make a playlist. Okay. Matthew's the author of a book we're going to discuss today, a book that, by the way, might be the best book I've ever read in my life. And I feel like I don't know if I've read like 2,000 books. It literally might be the best. I'm making them blush over here. The book is called The God of the Mundane, Reflections on Ordinary Life for Ordinary People. The God of the Mundane, Reflections on Ordinary Life for Ordinary People. And that's Cruciform Press 2021, which was the second edition, just came out. So like there's Calvin's Institutes, Boving's Dogmatics, C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, Hudson Taylor's Spiritual Secret, Confessions of St. Augustine, Pilgrim Progress. And then there's people like James K.A. Smith, Tish Warren, N.T. Wright. But you guys, yep, above. I'm top shelving this. This is the book like I want to give my kids, every person in my church, a short 131 pages of pure wit and glory of the big picture of life for all of us normal people. Bro, you're handing out rest and joy like a Bahamas honeymoon. I wrote that last night.
That's awesome. I love that. I love that. That was the goal. So that's good.
Yeah, and a friend even texted me this morning saying like she had just finished the book and she's going to reread it every single month. She even sent me questions to ask you. So anyways, which is, by the way, because the good folks at Cruciform are allowing us to give away 3 copies of the book. So to enter, just find the Layman's Lounge on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Like, follow us, maybe share this post, tag a friend, or just be like, hey, I could really use this book. And then you'll be entered. We'll announce it in 1 week. Okay. So because the book is written with such clarity and precise diagnostics, I'm mainly just going to read sections from the book and ask you to respond. That'll be like the form of the question. And I'll start with this one where I think you capture the default plight for many of us when you say, quote, "But there was another man, a man stuck in a job that feels small, a job making him feel small. He's not embarrassed of his job so much as just like miserable. On Monday, he can barely stay awake because he's been awake since 3:45, dreading the day ahead. Sometimes he's so full of anger at his plight. He believes he believes the gospel, but has no idea what that means for him in this dead-end job." I'm just going to read that part again. He believes the gospel, but has no idea what that means for him in his dead-end job. He also reads books and hears sermons, and they make his work feel even smaller. So, and then you continue on. "I stared down into the faux wood grain of my desk and cursed the moment I ever sat down behind it. I've had so many days where I was on the verge of emotionally losing control. I had to leave my desk and go look at myself in the mirror and let this is me, bro. And my kids remind me, and let my gray hairs remind me that I'm a grown man. My tie was a noose and my name tag felt like a guilty verdict." End quote. Brother, this is the somber song that most of us sing. Why? Why?
So that's from that's like the foreword or introduction, right?
Yeah.
So I wrote the book, I was pastoring a church, and I won't get into the story. But I was pretty burnt out after going through a hard time at that church. And my dad was sick in Birmingham. We were in Birmingham. We didn't want to move. And so we decided for me to just take a break and look for just whatever job I could find. And believe it or not, Greek and Hebrew do not qualify you for many jobs. And so I ended up desperate, and I was actually at a Shovels and Rope concert, and I ran into a buddy of mine from college, and he said, "Hey, if you get to where you want to talk to me about working in the bank, I'd be glad to see if I can get you an interview, get you a job." He was a regional manager. So I was getting pretty desperate. And so I took that job. And so when I wrote that part of the book, I was actually a pastor. But when I wrote that introduction, which you just read, I had transitioned into working in a bank. And it was awful. It was really brutal. And it was, I kind of joke, I've joked with people, if you write a book called The God of the Mundane, you're going to end up having to face down who that God is for you. And I did. I mean, it was a really hard time. I mean, I was the worst banker in the world. I'd probably been working there about 6 months, and I was working with a lady trying to help her through a problem she was having, getting some paperwork for it and everything. And I said, "Hey, I got to go talk to my manager. I'm really struggling, with this." And I said, "I've only been doing this for about 6 months." She's like, "What did you do before that?" And I said, "Well, I was a pastor." She said, "You should go back to that." She was not being nice when she said it either. And so it was real that was a really hard time. It's funny when you read that, and when I've gone back and read that, I can feel that. It's funny. I actually really enjoyed writing that part of the book because it was so, those were such powerful feelings, and I knew them well. It was funny. I in the acknowledgement section, I was listening to a lot of Springsteen during that time and really getting into his stuff as an adult. And I was listening to Darkness on the Edge of Town, and I was like, man, I understand that harshness of adulthood that he was writing about. And in many ways, that album kind of became a soundtrack for me during that time, because it really is about the harshness of adulthood, and I was feeling that. I mean, I was, so that was a hard time, but I'm always glad to go back and read that. And when people tell me that they get it, when they say, hey, when you wrote that part right there about the name tag and the tie and all that, and they tell me how meaningful that was, I was like, well, it was pretty meaningful for me too.
Yeah, bro. If you just Google your name, and if people review the book or even your own post, it's insane. Almost always the comments are always like, I'm crying right now, or I have such freedom and joy after you share. And that is so telling. But like most of the time, posts are about some, and this is a theological truth, what you're saying, but a lot of times it's a theological truth, and people are like, yes, I wish those other heretics were aware of this. And it's like, it's not life-giving. It's like, and again, we love theology, but what you've put together is an overflow of the heart, like such insight. I love it. So I think 40 years ago, this was like the question right here. Hey man, if you were to die tonight, do you know where you would spend eternity? But I think your peppering of questions are the ones that people today are actually asking it. And here's those questions that you ask. Quote, is there a God? Is there a God, for instance, for those who are not changing anything but diapers? Is there a God for those who simply love their spouse and pour out rarely appreciated affection on their children day after day? They're never grateful, right? Is there a God for the mom who spends what feels like God-forsaken days changing diapers and slicing up hot dogs? Is there a God for the man who hammers out a day's work in obscurity for the love of his wife and kids? Is there a God for just and kind employers, generous homemakers, day laborers, who would look at a missions trip to Romania like it was an unimaginable vacation? And then you continue on. The question stretches out into the pew, where it steals away into suburban homes and places of work and various schools. It breaks into bedrooms and boardrooms. Is there a God who makes sense of the lived between? Is there a God who makes sense of the lived between the seismic and the extraordinary, between the missions trips and between the joy and the pain? Is there a God for the meantime? Can you, end quote, can you not like respond to that question, but respond to why it's a nagging question? And like most of us who aren't pastors or missionaries, that is like, it is not even just a question. It's almost like a identity or a burden that we bear. What is the diagnosis of that?
Well, all those questions, I don't know if you could find it, but I had a previous blog that I did. I don't even remember the name of it, to be honest. But this book was kind of born out of a blog post called "The God of the Mundane." That this was back in like 2010, maybe early 2010. So I know that's only 11 years ago, but that's light years ago in blogging. I mean, blogging was exploding. It was easier to go viral back then than it is now. I mean, not everybody was I didn't know anybody who was blogging besides me at the time. And so that got that post got a lot of traction, and it came from a couple things. Number one, it came from some of the mistakes that I'd probably made in ministry after reading. And I'm going to say, it's going to sound like I'm being critical of two books, but I'm really not. I'm not critical of them. I just think there needs to be a message alongside them. Books like Don't Waste Your Life and Radical. Both of those books are very good books. And Don't Waste Your Life especially was a very helpful book for me in many ways as a pastor. And I was very thankful for it. Thankful for John Piper and his ministry, and just so thankful for these men. And then Radical, I was serving in Birmingham when I wrote this, and I kept running into people who were sitting under Platt's ministry, which I'm very thankful for, but they were feeling very guilty about, that identity that you were talking about. They were feeling guilty about not doing enough. And so that was kind of going on. And then I was working in this young hipster church. I think I was the oldest person in the church at 37. And I'm working with all these young people, and they're great. I mean, I loved them. They're great. I still love them. But a lot of them they were wanting to raise money. There were some young people that were wanting to raise money to go overseas and do short-term mission trips, but we were struggling to get help in the nursery. And so that was kind of part of it. And I felt like there was the guilt, right, of those who were feeling the identity crisis. And then there was the pressure that others were of not necessarily taking seriously the small, obscure parts of life. Mm-hmm. And so that's where that came from. I mean, that was, but you ask why that's the thing. I think there's a couple things. I think celebrity Christianity has made that really hard for people. Mm. It's made living in obscurity really hard. It's made doing small things hard. And so I think also small places, I would say, small out of the way places, small churches for pastors. I mean, thankfully there's a lot of good men who are championing small churches now, but that was not going on 10 plus years ago, mm-hmm. as much as it is now. And so, I think there's a lot of things at play, but I really think an image-driven, celebrity-obsessed culture where bigger is always better creates an environment in which people struggle to feel like the little things they do day in and day out don't matter. Mm-hmm.
In another sort of half soul crushing yet half life giving section of the book, you say, quote, "We wake up in the morning, shower, dress in last year's fashions, eat the same breakfast we did the day before, kiss our significant other, kiss the kids, go to work or stay home for the work that never ends. We have supper, we watch TV, do it again. Though we enjoy vacations and short seasons of excitement, we, for the most part, have ordinary days and expect that for the rest of them. Oh, we want to be famous, known, and revered, but that's not the reality. The reality is no one will write books about us, and outside of our families, we will be forgotten." And then you continue on. "We may flirt with greatness, but the fact is, for the Christian and non-Christian, ordinary is the divine order of the day for the vast majority of us." Brother, how can that be that ordinary is the divine order of the day?
Well, I think that C.S. Lewis's quote is true about, you have never met a mere mortal. And he talks about how, we're all extraordinary. And there's a sense in which that is very true. And I absolutely agree with him. I would very rarely, argue with C.S. Lewis. He owns a whole shelf at home on my bookshelf. But the problem is comparatively speaking, in a celebrity driven, excitement drunk culture, most of what we do really is pretty ordinary. I mean, now I know some people who are writers, and I know some people who have some fame in some circles, and but that's only because I've written a book. I mean, that's the only reason I really know these people. and and most people don't deal with fame or anything. It's just an ordinary life. It's very now that doesn't mean that God cannot do extraordinary things in them in the place of that ordinary life. That is absolutely true. I mean, salvation itself is a pretty extraordinary event. I mean, it's a transformative, supernatural event that happens in the life of a person.
Yes, brother.
But it is also, and it makes us aware of an unseen world, the highest realities being the unseen ones, in which is very extraordinary. And then we live a life that is in many ways extraordinary. Okay, so that's true. It's not untrue, but in the whether you want to call irony or paradox, is that we live out that extraordinary life as ordinary people in ordinary places doing ordinary things.
So good.
We are supernatural beings. The homemaker is a supernatural being now that will live forever, even though she is scraping up the macaroni and cheese off the linoleum.
Bro, amen. Amen. Oh, swimming in that crystal Bahama water right now. Thank you. In the chapter called The Apostle Paul or the Person in the Pew, ? The Apostle Paul or the Person in the Pew. You said, quote, sometimes we may miss things because they're hidden, but we seem to always miss much because we see it every day. I miss the obvious. The apostles are writing to normal people. Most of them are nameless. They are Jews and Gentiles, yes, but they're also not apostles, and most are not pastors. They're carpenters, farmers, traders, sailors, fishermen, shepherds, guards. They are mothers and fathers and children. And compared to the life of an apostle, their lives are probably mundane. These are ordinary men and women believing an extraordinary story. That is such a great find that was hidden in plain sight, like you say. Can you unpack that reality of what you see there?
Yeah, this was when I was writing the book, and I think I already had the contract for the book. I just needed to, and I needed some more chapters. And I was reading, I think I was reading in like Ephesians, and Ephesians has got a lot of big concepts, big meta concepts, right? And I realized as I was reading through Ephesians, it's not really dealing with any kind of specific problems that we know of, or we're not sure of, not like, the church in Corinth, or,
right.
Not dealing with Judaizers that we know of. So I realized that, and I'm just sitting there thinking, why would Paul, use, there's just so much there, so much to unpack. And then and then out of nowhere, it just kind of dawned on me that, there's just not a whole lot about these people and their lives that he's writing to. And then my mind just kept going, and I realized, look, this isn't, they're not pastors. These are bakers and farmers and carpenters, and then it really just started kind of blowing my mind that I had missed the reality that the apostles are writing to people who are, living out the faith in, as a businessman or a homemaker or a mom and a dad, sibling, member of a larger family, a member of a small community, maybe, of people. And so some of them would have maybe even been tempted to join some of the cultic guilds that revolved around particular vocations. And so that was a huge realization. I was like, how did I miss this? And I think it's one of those things that's so obvious. Like, I couldn't even find hardly anybody that wrote about it. I don't remember finding anybody writing about that. And that I think it was just it was so hidden in plain sight. But it was it was really good for me to realize, because I had taught and preached and written oftentimes in a way that was basically like, you need to be like me
Mm-hmm.
as a pastor. Your Christian life should look just like mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you, I hit that a little bit below, but I had a question for you as far as like how should we, who are just the laity, who are butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, how should we read, we read Acts, for example. Let's not even say Acts, let's just say the letters, the epistles. It's just like high theology, let's call it high theology, and an emphasis on, Jew-Gentile relations, and and salvation. Does it talk about just sort of normal life, like the in between those, like, okay, well, now that I'm a Christian, now what? What? Yeah, what sort of lens, or how do you read the Bible without thinking, oh, I need to also be writing letters to churches in Uzbekistan or whatever?
Right. I don't necessarily know that you need a lens. I think, though, it is good to remember, and to be honest, I think a lot of people, they instinctively realize this, who live in the normal world. I think a lot of people probably instinctively get this, but the problem is that they translate very quickly to the real, 2.0 Christian life is pastoral ministry, or 3.0 is going to missions overseas, or something like that, right? I mean, and when it should cause us to relax, if you're working, in the the business world, or a homemaker, you're not in pastoral ministry, that if you're doing that, this should cause you to relax and go, you know what, that's who these letters are for. This is for me.
Yeah.
This is for me. When Paul writes in Philippians 4, when he says, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, and I tell people all the time when I'm counseling, I'm like, when Paul says don't be anxious about anything, that the difficulty with that Greek word anything is it means anything. And then he says in everything, and he says with prayer and thanksgiving and with supplication and thanksgiving, and sometimes that's translated gratitude, right? And so when I think to translate that day to day is that that's the life of a mom, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I talk to so many moms who are dealing with anxiety and mom guilt all the time, and so I think that was written for moms. It was written for men who are maybe a small business owner, who it is really hard for them to relax, because when you're a small business owner, if you take off work, you may not make money. And so don't be anxious. Realize that there's something more significant for you as a husband, a dad, as a small business owner, and somebody who has to provide. There's something more significant than your actual showing up for work, and it may be your prayers of supplication and your gratitude for what you have.
You continued on in that section where you were talking about the apostle Paul, or the person in the pew. You said, quote, for some, this whole idea of identifying with the person in the pew instead of the apostle Paul will be a challenge. Maybe it will feel like a death to a dream of being someone special, out of the ordinary and above the fray. The idea of being one of the forgotten is formidable, but for countless others, this is the second greatest piece of news they have ever heard. Wait, it's all right for me to be ordinary? I can live a mundane existence and not feel guilty about it? You mean the call of my life is for me to be faithful right where I am? Brother, for me, that is the second greatest news. It is so refreshing, and now I need to learn into that, and lean into that reality, and we'll hit that more. But why is it such good news? Why is this such a sweet medicine for us? Why is it like oil running off of Aaron's beard?
That's a great simile there, by the way. That's awesome. I think the reason why is because when you finally understand the grace and mercy of the gospel, and you realize, and it frees you from works righteousness, I think this is the same thing. It's almost kind of like a version of it.
Whoa, that's good.
If you think about that, if you think about this, I need to do something big for Jesus. You don't have to go very far back into like the 90s, I don't think. And there would be, you'll be things like calling to, live out loud, do something on fire, is always something this kind of explosive version of Christianity. It had to be anthemic almost.
Yeah.
And I think some people are probably called to that. I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
But if you're not, I think the reason why that feels so good is that you can actually be doing a lot for the kingdom by being faithful right where you are, even if you don't see it. I think faithfulness I think we're so worried about being able to see the impact that we have, instead of and part of that's just control, right? We get worried. Are we having an impact for Christ or whatever, and don't get me wrong. I think that's in some ways kind of a shadow side of a good thing, right? I mean, the desire for a young person to want to have an impact for Christ on the world, that's a beautiful thing. I mean, it's not a terrible thing. It can become very legalistic and a burden, though, when you forget that you can have a huge impact on the world and die nameless.
Yes.
What was it? Count Zinzendorf, or whatever his name was. He said, be forgotten. He was talking to missionaries. I love that. I love that idea of not having to be, remembered.
Yeah.
That's when you can get there, man, that is a liberating, it's very liberating.
Bro, yes. Yeah. It's like it said, like preach the gospel and like die and be forgotten, or some glorious
I love
thing.
that.
But let's hone in on that preach the gospel part. I just heard something yesterday that made me throw up in my mouth, and I was hoping you would touch on it. And that was, this guy said, not everyone's, called to go do missions. And, some of us are supposed to be welders. I was like, yes, this guy, he's going to hit it. And then he's like, because you know why? You gotta tithe to those guys. You got to support them. They're on the front lines. And so my question for you is the most pious Christian thing that a Christian, like a busy Christian mom or a dad in a cubicle could do, is to tithe to the real frontline Christians. At most, and at worst, just make sure they announce the gospel to their colleagues around the water tank. But like, what if you volunteer for, I'm just making a random scenario, you don't make any money, and what if you don't have anyone around you, don't have time? Are you still pleasing to God, or are you now like sub-Christian?
Yeah, it's almost like the seeing your job only as a way to evangelize others, instead of seeing your job as work that's part of the kingdom.
Amen.
I think that some of this is maybe I hesitate to use this phrase, but I'm going to use it and I'm going to explain it. A truncated gospel. The gospel is really just about you being justified and staying out of hell, right? Yep. And I think that's truncated. I mean, work was created before sin. And so if that being true, that tells us there is some, in God's economy, the work that we do is a really important part of his rule and reign in our lives, and in the rule and reign in this world. And so, and I love, I mean, to me, that's kind of good news, right? It's good news to know that the things that we do, whether we're, let's say somebody is we use banker because I worked in a bank. Let's say somebody, when you work in a bank and you are honest and ethical and above board, and you don't do anything that would contradict what you believe about what it means to follow Jesus and who Jesus is for you in your life. And you work hard and you're successful in that. And that is an important part of being a member of God's kingdom, a citizen of God's kingdom.
Amen.
It's not just to give money to missions. Giving money to missions is great. I mean, it really is. I love missionaries. I love to read missionary biographies. Love them. Just read a fantastic one that I'm doing a write-up on the book for Lilias Trotter, who most people don't know about. It's a fascinating story. And but all of that is, I think we kind of make pastors and missionaries into kind of like celebrities. And so we try to model ourselves on, or our identity then becomes we're not that. And so now we've got to support that to make us feel good about not being that.
Yep.
And that's terrible. It's a terrible way to live.
I remember when the things of God became the most important thing to me, the first thing I thought was like, well, I gotta be a pastor. I had no desire to like be a pastor, but I was like, I gotta do that because that's when you're a legit Christian, you become a pastor. And I remember that just sort of sucking the life out of me or whatever. So can you speak to this quote right here? The story of what God has done has been replaced by the story of us, a tragic comedy featuring all of what we have done and have not done. The wrong story yields the wrong answers. We look at our own story and see nothing spectacular.
Yeah. I think the difficulty of the Christian life for a lot of people is the nuance between the Bible calling us to be a certain kind of person but realizing that it's really not about us. That's in many ways kind of hard. It's hard to realize that it's a book for us, and it's a book that is calculated for our good, and yet it is not about us. And that once you realize that, it can be that I keep using the word liberating, but it can be so liberating, because then it becomes, once you realize it's not about you, it's about God, that puts you in a position where you actually believe that God can work through you wherever you are.
Yeah. So up until now, we really have sort of been diagnosing, if you will, giving a name to this this horrible plight, this truncated gospel, this Christian life thing, whatever it is. But now, I would have just been happy had you just diagnosed that, but you do go on and really give us some tangibles, if you will, beyond just ethereal notions. And so this one I love so much, and I was wondering if you could just teach us a little bit. And that is, you use the language of pushing back against the fall. And so I'm going to read this quote because it's so good, and if you could just unpack it for us and how we could do it in our own lives. You said, the problem is that sometimes we pastors tend to forget this. We forget our calling is different from the calling of those we teach and counsel. We push back against the effects of the fall through the ministry of the word, through counseling and preaching, studying and leading. Plumbers push back the effects of the fall through fixing leaky pipes, Teachers do it through making sure children learn how to count and read and write. Bankers push against the fall with safes and loans to small businesses. Farmers with combines and turn rows. Librarians with organized shelves full of wonder and adventure and beauty. Baristas with coffee, muffins, and smiles. Cooks push back with duck à l'orange, chicken marsala, and pizza. Homemakers with clean floors and changed diapers and home-cooked meals. Artists push back the fall with songs and paintings and pictures and story. So, man, can you tell us what is the nature of this pushing back and how it's lived out, even like a mom or whatever?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know where I got the pushing back against the fall picture from. It's too good for it to have come from me. Let's put it that way. But I love it because the fall's effect. You don't have to read very far in the theologians to talk about all of suffering comes from either sin or the effect of sin, and the effect of sin is everywhere, right? I mean, it's whatever vocation you're in, wherever you are in life, you're dealing with the effects of sin. And when we and so in every job we can push back against that. Now sometimes it's just being honest in your job. Honesty in your job is a huge, I mean, just imagine the way it would change a culture if everybody resolved just to be honest.
Yep.
If the hamburger that they advertised to you was the one that they served to you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, or the car that they sold you was the one that they advertised to you. Whatever it is, truth in advertising, but just truth everywhere. And that is a pushing back against the. I mean, think. I'm. I don't know. Do y'all have even Chick-fil-A in Hawaii?
No.
Okay,
but we
you've
know
heard
about
of
it,
though, right? Okay, so it's this phenomenon that just started in the South and now it's spread throughout the continental United States. And we kind of joke about people, you may have even seen the memes that that if you put Chick-fil-A in charge of vaccine distribution, it would have gotten done very quickly, right? And the reason why, well, I mean, here's a company that was started by people who believe the gospel, and they do things, quality things, with a lot of efficiency, and the fact that it is a pleasant experience when you go there, and they do everything they can to make it a pleasant experience. It's kind of like Publix. We have another place called Publix. It's a grocery store chain here. I don't know if y'all have that, but it's the same thing. The whole culture is to make you have an enjoyable experience. And, you just think of, doing something like that, I think is a pushing back against the fall. But I think about, musicians for me and how life-giving that can be, because the fall is all about sin and death. And whenever we are doing something that is life-giving to people, that's when we're pushing back, where it's light pushing against darkness. It's in many ways, vocational reflections of that. When Paul in Colossians 3 talks about us being rescued from the domain of darkness and being transformed into these sons of light. And so anytime that happens, anytime we do something that is life-giving and light, giving, when that happens, we, in many ways, we're kind of reflecting back, we're pushing back against these enemies, the great enemies of sin and death.
Yes. Amen.
We're resisting them instead of going with the flow.
You said, quote, "The number of sermons, good and bad, that I've heard must number on up into the thousands, and my memory is pretty good. But I have never heard a sermon calling me to live quietly." And then you ask, quote, so what might a sermon or lesson of the aspiration to live quietly look like? And then you sort of leave us with that. So might you just teach us that because there's this passage where we're told to live quietly, and I think another part, you're like, can you imagine a conference on living quietly?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, it would be a killer, right? I mean, most people would show up for a conference where you live loud for Jesus, make a noise for Jesus, be, stir the pot for Jesus. There's a lot of that. And again, for pastors, in many ways, that's what they do. Those of us that are in ministry, that's kind of our life, right? And I think that's okay. Although I would say there is a sense in which pastors could learn from this too, this living quietly, not having to have attention, I think is part of that. In other words, not having to be the center of attention, not having to, live a life that's a raised voice all the time. I assume that living quietly is also, if you're getting attention, it's for things like humility and contentedness.
Wow.
Peace, being a person who is a person of peace.
Yeah, brother.
And I fail at that a lot. I mean, I'm a natural extrovert. I'm a natural person who, now the older I get, the less of that is, that's less true. But I think that there's I think also along with that, I think this needs to be said. This is certainly, I would certainly teach this, that there is a living quietly would also a calm assurance in the goodness of God in whatever circumstance. Which, when you think about what we've been through the past year, it is I'm amazed at the way the church has shown so little assurance. They've looked afraid, mad and afraid.
Yeah. You kind of continuing on that where you said maybe a truncated gospel, if you will, that a lot of us have, been burdened under. In the chapter called The Gospel of Something Else Entirely, you said, quote, "When people would walk away from the Christian faith, I used to find it odd. Now that I understand the poverty of the gospel of something else entirely, I wonder why it doesn't happen more. How much harder must it be to hold on to the gospel of a kingdom that isn't continually present and active and significant?" Brother, I couldn't agree more. Like, if Christianity is a heaven to gain and hell to shun, and the Christian life is sin management, those are true. I mean, all those things, but it really is, it's truncated. It's like, I think N.T. Wright talks about, like, it's only like one of the four speakers in the car working. It's like, yeah, I guess I could hear the song and sing along. But my question for you is, if you only had 1 minute with a person who has given up on that the gospel of something else entirely, if you only just had like a few moments with them, just one message to convey to them, what would it be?
I would apologize and say, I'm sorry that the church has taught you a truncated gospel. But there is a gospel of not just the future and not just your belief in the past, but one in which you can walk with God now, wherever you are. There is a message of whatever life that wherever you are in life, you can walk with him and he will be with you. And that doesn't mean you have to be a pastor or a missionary or in full-time ministry. But it is one of being close to Jesus. And far too often, Christianity is not about Jesus.
That's right. A dear friend, Allie, she wrote me a question for you, and I thought it was a good one. And she said, how do we apply the message in The God of the Mundane as parents as we speak into the lives of our children? Yeah. Like, what are we praying on the way to school? What are we majoring on?
So I obviously, because this has been at the forefront of my, when you write a book about something, it becomes something, in some ways, a lens through which you process information. And so for me, I have had a lot of talks with my kids about things like fame and celebrity and the problems of that, and the importance of simply trying to be kind wherever you are. And those kinds of, we live in a culture in which, and our kids hear this too. My kids are homeschooled now, but they were in public school for a long time. And they were constantly hearing things about being part of a movement. The need, kids are that's going to excite them, right? To be a part of something bigger than themselves. And we were created for that, to be honest. We were created to be a part of something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And so kids, but they respond back by being, whether it's a social cause or a political movement or something like that. And I tell them, I remind my kids all the time, it is more important how you treat your waitress and how you treat the people that you come in contact with and your siblings than whatever big thing you care about in a moment. We've had that conversation many times, and it's really hard for kids to buy into, especially when they become teenagers. I have teenagers now, and teenagers are in some ways kind of spring loaded to join something bigger than themselves.
Yep. Yeah, that whole like curved inward is even the sense of that. Yeah, I want to be part. Oh, I think I read a quote. Matthew Kamenik, he said, "Everyone wants a revolution, but no one wants to do the dishes." And I thought that was so good. I appreciate it, and I'm convicted by your common sense, scathing rebuke to me when you said, quote, I mean, it's in the book, but it was to me, quote, "Beholding the God of martyred missionaries is easy. Discerning the God of the ascetic who has refused all temporal comforts is a piece of cake. But perceiving the God of those whose days are marked by the number of diapers changed is remarkably hard. The prevailing view of spirituality leaves us with 10,000 moments void of the glorious God. He is present when we do things like pray, read our Bibles, sing worship songs, give away our stuff, and go overseas. But he's strikingly absent when we are doing mundane paperwork." Then you continue, "It's the big stuff that looks excellent on spiritual resumes. And it's these we use to determine the authenticity of the faith of God's people. The smaller acts of kindness, they not only do not show up, but their absence is justified by the former. In other words, we want to end war, hunger, and poverty in our lifetime, but we do not possess the will to let someone merge in front of us in traffic and do so with a smile." I think that's right. Can you just hit that with us?
Yeah, that was more of a rebuke on me than anybody. It's always good when you hear your words read back to you and you're like, yeah, I need to hear that. That's good. And we live in this world in which it's almost kind of a cliche of someone being very spiritual, and yet in the day in and day out, they can be kind of a jerk, I remember having a conversation when I don't think I was in college anymore. I was single, and I was talking with a girl who was a friend of mine, and she described another guy as being very spiritual. Now, I won't pretend that it kind of bothered me that she didn't describe me as spiritual. She described this guy as spiritual. And I asked her why, and she couldn't answer at first. And I said, does it have anything to do with the fact that he raises his hands when we're singing? And she kind of smiled. And I was like, it does, doesn't it? And she was like, well, yeah, that's one of the first things I think of. And I told her, I said, Paul describes spirituality in terms of, the fruits of the Spirit. And, things like kindness and gentleness and self-control. And I think that though does not get a whole lot of play with people, because it doesn't really, it's not the kind of thing, if you, go do medical missions 2 weeks out of the year, that gets people's attention. But just being a kind employer oftentimes does not.
That's
Sometimes
good.
it does, or just being kind to the checkout lady,
Totally.
not getting angry in traffic, being kind, assuming the best of people when they cut in front of you.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things, those small kind of everyday things, are not going to win any applause. But I think that when we ignore those, and here's the thing. If I could add to this book, you're always thinking that way when you write a book. But if I could add to this book, I wish I had written about when we actually obey God in those small moments. That is one way in which he is present with us in those moments.
Wow. Yeah.
And I wish I had either added that in somewhere. I don't think I did at any point in time, but think about Jesus in John talks about, if you abide with me, and he links that abiding, loving, and obeying. And I want to abide with Jesus as much as I can. And I know that when I disobey, I am putting distance between me and him fellowship wise to some degree, at least on my part, maybe not on his part, but on my part, it pulls me away. Yeah. But when I am seeking to follow him, regardless of the consequences, I always feel closer to him. I wouldn't say always, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I got you.
But I know I know a fellowship with him when I'm walking in obedience. That's not legalism. It's just effort, right?
Yeah. I used to believe and think your church is only as, if you're like in leadership or something, like your church is only as strong as your prayer group. And then I realized, I think, and this might be wrong, but you get the idea. I think your church and your prayer group, if you will, is sort of almost only as strong as your home. And I'm realizing as the older I get, it's really those being faithful in those little things, which are the biggest things, like just, not assuming my wife will take the recycled bottles out because it's overflowing. That one's like so hard for me. Or getting on my hands and knees and playing with my kids because I'm like, oh, my back. But it's like, put my phone down and look at them. Like, to me, that is like just true spirituality, because it's loving them well, and it's what we're called to do. But anyways, man, last question for you. And brother, this is just so good. Again, it's just the best book ever. Thank you. In one of the final chapters, you give us something that we should concern ourselves about. And that is, quote, "The room must grow." Can you please sort of take us out with that and tell us what you mean by the room must grow, and how we proceed with that?
Well, if I remember correctly, this is one I'm not sure I remember the whole chapter, but you tell me. I remember the memory of going to I think I used the example of my grandparents' home, and it seemed so huge. And then as I got older, I went back to that house and I was able to look at it from the outside, and it was small.
Mm-hmm.
It was not a big house. And I got to thinking about my own kids, about how, the house we were living at the time had a vaulted ceiling, very big living area space, and how as they got older, that room would get smaller too. And I think the lesson for me there is that, we tend to, we needed a larger vision of what the Christian life was.
Yes.
Not a small vision.
Yes.
And I think oftentimes as we grow, we get, so when I was a teenager, I don't think I talk about this in the chapter, but when I was a teenager, I was that on fire kid. I went to every Bible study I could. I was really on fire. And then as I got older and I got an adult and I grew, it was easier for bills and leaky pipes and things like that to distract me constantly. And being a homeowner, and all being married and having kids, and having a kid with a disability. All those things can be distracting, and can, and in other words, the room can get smaller, and so I think my heart, or my desire, was for us to revert back to where the room was big in many ways, and not be in big, not in the fact that we're on fire so much as everything matters, and it's bigger than we think it is. It's not just justification by faith and then going to heaven when you die. It's bigger than that. And that's hard, because that takes effort to think that way and to live that way. Again, not legalism, but effort. Not earning, but effort.
Mm-hmm. We've been talking with Matthew B. Redmond. You could follow him on Twitter at Matt Redmond. We'll link that up. The book is The God of the Mundane: Reflections on Ordinary Life for Ordinary People, and that's Cruciform Press 2021. And again, the good folks at Cruciform are allowing us to give away 3 copies. So follow us, tag a friend, share a post, or just write, hey man, I could really use this book, and we'll choose 3 of you guys. And then just, you could go to mattbredmond.com. He blogs there sporadically with little, very sporadically, but it's good. Even like the Friday updates, he's like, oh, one more thing, Bob Dylan's the best ever, or something like that. And then listen to this, redmondchristiancounseling.net. Matthew's a counselor, and I haven't sat down with him yet. Maybe I get some pro bono stuff, but you could assume that there's some life and rest there. So brother, thank you so much for the book. I hope every single person reads it, and your head doesn't, your ego doesn't grow too much, but the Lord use you, bro.
Oh man, listen, I've gotten enough bad reviews, and it'd probably be good for your listeners to hear one of them. One of them was, he says the same thing in every chapter, and I was like, okay, good. That's what I was after.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it.
We came for salvation. We came for family. We came for all that's good. That's how we'll walk away. We came to break the bad. We came to cheer the sad.